next speaker, Dr. Eoin Reeves. Paper is under the title Public Capital Investment and Public-Private Partnerships in Ireland 2000-2014, a review of the issues and performances. Dr. Reeves is Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics in the University of Limerick and a Director of the Privatisation and PPP Research Group. His research interests lie primarily on market-based reforms of the public sector and the regulation of infrastructure. This includes issues such as privatisation, liberalisation and different forms of private sector participation in the delivery of public services. Eoin has published a number of economic studies of such reforms in edited books and international peer-reviewed journals.
On this first slide, I really want to focus on the whole area of infrastructure policy. Infrastructure policy, it's not a discipline. It's not something that captures a lot of attention. But I think everybody in this country knows, particularly given what's going on with Irish Water, etc., how important infrastructure is to everybody. So, I mean, the minute we get up in the mornings, the moment we go to bed at night, we rely on public infrastructure, and it has a huge impact on the quality of our lives. In terms of water infrastructure, transport, energy, etc., etc. It goes without saying, but sometimes we need to remind ourselves, and again, the water debacle brings that into sharp focus. From an economic perspective, infrastructure is critical. There's a well-established literature on the importance of public investment in terms of promoting economic growth. So, post the crisis, a lot of people in this country called for the government to intervene and inject stimulus, and to a large degree that was rejected. In some respects that was inevitable given the lack of fiscal space for a stimulus, but the fact remains that when government invests in infrastructure, there's an immediate demand side effect in terms of employment creation, spending and knock-on multiplier effects. But the longer term benefit that comes from infrastructure investment is that it creates the supply side capacity for growth and then the delivery of public services and improvement of quality of life on the back of that. And that's the purpose of investing in infrastructure. From an Irish perspective, it's even more important given the direction and the strategy, the industrial strategy that Ireland has pursued since the early 60s, which is to work in an open economy model or a regional economy model that Paul Krugman refers to, which relies heavily on exports and the attraction of foreign direct investment. And that relies very, very heavily on the quality of infrastructure. And it's one of the key factors that managers, multinational corporations take into account when they make decisions in relation to invest in the economy. So there's something in infrastructure in relation to all aspects of quality of life and economy. And the last point I have there is just infrastructure policy. Infrastructure policy covers a whole range of issues. It covers decisions about the level of public expenditure that the government sets, issues in relation to project selection, issues in relation to project appraisal, procurement, and the management and maintenance of infrastructure going forward. And they're the kind of issues I want to touch on today, especially when I get down to talking about PPPs. So, just the next two slides just briefly review the trends in public capital expenditure in Ireland since before and after the crash, since about 2000. So the point I just want to make on this slide here that you see behind, if you focus there on the bars particularly, what you have there are on the bars are the levels of public capital expenditure. Now that's exchequer capital expenditure and non-exchequer capital expenditure, which would be spent by semi-states, etc., like the ESB and so on. And you can see at the bars there the huge rise in capital spending from the late 90s on, meaning it was pro-cyclical. It happened at the time of the boom, and the government was racing to provide the capacity to deal with the pressures coming from extraordinary economic growth. And then it peaked at about 12.5 billion in 2008, and then it was cut dramatically. And what's going on there is that the trend is following the business cycle. More spending at the times of growth, less spending at the time of boom, which is completely it was the complete opposite of what the traditional Keynesian prescriptions would advise, which means that you actually do it the other way around. But that's just the real politics. That's the way it actually happens. I want to focus on the the level of expenditure cuts on the public capital side. And I borrowed these slides from Edgar Morganroth from DSRI. I have to actually say that because they're his slides. But this is a very useful exposition. What you have in that picture there are the planned expenditures under the National Development Plan for 2007 to 13, which of course was put in the bin as soon as the crisis happened. And you can see the numbers there. On average, the government planned to spend about 10 billion per year over that period. There were, and here we go, there were 6 revisions to this subsequently. So here you go. I won't go through each of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 revisions, okay? And you can see why I like this chart, because it shows the extent to which the planned levels of expenditure for the economy that were perceived to be needed back in 2007, how they were scaled down dramatically. So as it stands, we will spend, in exchequer terms, just exchequer terms, about 3.5 billion each year for the next 3 years. That's as far as the projections go, as per, we'll say, the last budget, which is very low. It's under 3% of GDP. It's closer to 2.5% of GNP, not GDP, GNP. And there's no one magic figure, but most commentators, I'm being a bit glib here, but most commentators would argue that about a 4% level of GDP for public capital investment is sustainable and required if countries around the world are to catch up with the massive infrastructure gaps that we have, not just in this country, but they apply elsewhere also. Now, having said that, and showing you that picture, we need to be realistic. There were certain justifications for those cuts. The first one really was that in real terms, the cuts weren't as severe as they looked on that chart, because tender prices fell by about 1/3 over that period. So in real terms, the cuts weren't as severe. They were severe, but not as severe as the previous chart would have suggested. Secondly, as the economy collapsed, there was actually less demand for infrastructure. Less people going to work, unfortunately. Less people putting demands on infrastructure, like transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and so on. So the needs weren't as great as when the National Development Plan was first devised, and the one I referred to earlier was published in 2007. And of course, we had a huge fiscal crisis, which meant there was less space for this. Although there was a debate, and it's not a debate that I think that got a sufficient enough airing about whether the government should seek to inject more stimulus than it did. But we know the way. We all understand how things went in that regard. But having said that, notwithstanding these justifications, the reality is that reduced investment has serious consequences. So the next graph is a graph that that's sourced from the CSO and the National Treasury Management Agency, but it's a very, very telling graph and a worrying one. What you have there is the overall investment, not just public capital investment. This is overall investment in the economy over time, going back to 1970. And the long run average is over 20%. It's about 22 or 23%. Right now, the level of overall investment in the economy is 11%. I think in the last year it jumped. But everything bounces back eventually. It jumped to 15%. It is way below the long-run average, which has huge consequences of the economy. And if we look at what has happened, the different components of aggregate demand or national income, since the crisis, the obvious one that fell, that dropped dramatically, and had such an impact on domestic demand, employment, and so on, was investment, because it fell so much. And that's what this chart is actually telling us. Our investment levels are way below European average and well below other peripheral countries like Spain, Portugal, and even Greece, which is really, really worrying. It's a big, big challenge moving forward to get investment back into the economy through the private sector and the public sector. So that's one consequence. I'll just go past this one pretty quickly. That slide is just designed to show you that in terms of executives' perceptions of the quality of Irish infrastructure, we still rank. Ireland is out there on the right-hand side in the green bar. We're well below the EU average in terms of just a very cursory look at the quality of infrastructure as judged by, we'll say, the opinions of business executives, and that's taken from the National Competitiveness Council annual reports. So this slide is similar to one that Sean put up earlier, where I tried to just identify the areas where we have serious infrastructure gaps. So we've issues in relation to the stock of our public infrastructure, per capita, which is way below European averages. And we also have issues in relation to the quality of our public infrastructure. So areas where we have problems on both scores are water and waste management, obviously enough. I think we all understand the water issue, but the same applies in relation to waste management. The number there, the minus 5.06%, is the cuts on that category of capital spending since the crisis. Housing was referred to earlier, 90,000, 100,000 people in housing this. There was an initiative announced in the budget. I don't know how this is going to pan out, but we will get a chance to talk about that later on because it involves the use of PPPs to address the housing crisis. We've huge demographic changes coming down the line, which means there's a need for a massive school building programme, and that budget was cut, of course, between 08 and 14, as you see. Broadband is a massive issue, particularly the proportion of fixed broadband lines that are of high speed. And again, we mentioned this in discussion at the break. That's a legacy, in my view, to the silly decision to sell Eircom in its entirety. There was a case for privatising, but in this country, the government at the time completely lost the run of themselves and decided to sell it off in one go and lost control over, a really, really important state utility. And it was like one of the worst privatisation decisions, I think, worldwide since privatisation became popular in the early 80s. And the biggest, the expenditure heading that where the biggest cuts were experienced since 2008 are roads and public transport, with a 75% cut in nominal terms. But even though one of the legacies of the booms we hear our politicians talk about, we have the motorways. That's true, but we have really poor infrastructure outside of motorways in relation to secondary roads, etc., etc. So, there are areas where, if we were, if we decide to go down the route of investing in infrastructure, they're the areas that have been identified as the sectors in most need. So we're at the point now where actually things have changed, and unlike, say, 4 or 5 years ago when there was some debate about the case for a stimulus through public capital investment, there now is a very, very strong consensus around the fact that now is the time for a big investment push. First and foremost, finance is cheap. Okay, it's the government's long-term borrowing rate's 2%. Okay, so at this point, there's no question that finance is available, it's cheap, and investment in infrastructure can pay for itself. Moreover, one of the traditional arguments against public investment in a small open economy is that, number one, you'll have a crowding out effect. But because there's so much excess capacity in the economy, in terms of, obviously, unemployment was one aspect of excess capacity, that crowding out is not going to happen. Secondly, the multiplier effects, this got mentioned earlier there, the knock-on or spillover effects that can be quantified. Traditionally, multiplier effects are small for an open economy because of import leakages. But there has been some work done on multiplier effects in recent years, and multipliers now are estimated, roughly 1.5, 1.6, which is really positive. It means that there is a dividend and there is a return to be got from public capital investment. So there's a consensus across all, agencies like the ESRI. The IMF came out with a big report only a few weeks ago, suggesting that, or promoting the same argument that I'm putting forward here, and it applies not just to emerging and developing economies, but also to developed economies like Ireland, that now is the time for a big investment drive. Unfortunately, and I look forward to budget and see what actually would happen a few weeks ago, and it didn't deliver. I mentioned the fact that going forward, we're now planning just to spend less than around 2.5% of GNP on public capital investment. And going back to the point that Sean made earlier, it really kind of it depresses me at times when I think about, or I observe the debate around issues like what do citizens want? Do they want money in the pockets? Okay, or do they want investment in public services? It depends on the question is framed. But one of the newspapers before the budget ran, a fairly rudimentary poll, and that was the way the question was asked. And of course, people say they want money in their pockets, but the implication is that you don't put money then into infrastructure and public services, and that, as I said, that's something that we need to think about, and we really need a kind of serious, mature debate about issues like that. And I think that's a point that has come across in some of the talks earlier, and I fully concur with that. So, against that backdrop, okay, if the government doesn't want to put money into infrastructure via direct exchequer capital expenditure, that's not to say that they're not interested in the question of stimulus and so on. And in July 2012, we announced, or the government announced, a fairly small-scale stimulus package. And the announced intention was to inject 2.25 billion of public capital spending, or spending on public infrastructure. That's 2.25 on top of what would come through the exchequer spending. And the really interesting point in there was that 1.4 of that 2.25 was to come from the private sector. In other words, through public-private partnerships. So that brings me to public-private partnerships and private sector participation in the delivery of infrastructure. So PPP is a label that's thrown around very, very loosely, and it can mean lots of different things to different people. And I won't get into that debate right now, but suffice to say that when I refer to PPPs here, I'm talking about PPPs for the delivery of physical infrastructure, roads, schools, water infrastructure, and so on. Okay, so just so we're all on the same sheet, I just want to clarify: PPP it's a model of procurement, it's a means of procurement, and it's different from. There's always a counterfactual. So it's different from the traditional model of procurement, whereby, we'll say, a local authority, if it wanted to build a water treatment plant, it would have one contract for the design, another contract for the construction of the plant. It would be financed by the local authority from public funds. When the asset is built, it's handed over and it's operated thereafter. That's traditional procurement in action. All right? PPP is different because it integrates all those stages of the project life cycle. So the design, the build, and the operation of the asset are contracted out to a single private entity who will sign a contract for a 20 or 30-year period, and they'll take responsibility for all stages of the project life cycle. Okay? Now, so they come under different acronyms. So design, build, operate. That's just exactly what I described there for water, but the design, the build, the operate are all done by one contractor, and that's prevalent right throughout the country. All our water and wastewater treatment plants in this country have been built using the DBO model of PPP. The interesting ones from the government sector are the next two, DBFOM. The magic letter in there is F. Finance. The private sector puts up the finance. In other words, the private contractor borrows on private capital markets, and then some politicians suggest, ooh, free money. There's no such thing as free money. We pay back over time. But there's an attraction there for government. Concession PPPs, that's what's happening with roads, okay? It's similar to design, build, finance, operate PPPs, but the private sector does all that, but the payback comes from a mix of money from the public purse, but also user charges. So when you drive through the toll, you put your money in the bin, and that's why they're called concession charges, because there's an interface between the provider and the consumer. So private finance is absolutely at the core of the attraction of PPP for government. But not entirely, as I said. DBO is used in the water sector, and that's largely based on faith in the fact that the private sector does things better. The evidence is something we'll discuss later on. One really, really important element of PPP, I've mentioned the fact that it's long-term contracts. That's really important. Private finance is important, but it's also predicated on the fact that the model allows for better risk sharing between the public and the private sector. In other words, to deal with the problem, and traditional procurement, is the counterfactual, but it's bedeviled by problems also. So to deal with the problem of time and cost overruns, which have characterised big infrastructure in this country, like the Lewis, Dublin Port Tunnel, etc. The idea under PPP, the idea is that risk allocation, or the risks pertaining to a project, are shared optimally, and that incentivizes the private operator to deliver on time. And if they don't deliver on time, they don't get paid, and they can't pay back the people that they borrowed from. If they don't then make sure that the asset, it could be a school, is in proper working order and available for use, they don't get paid. That's the idea. And it sounds good on paper, but practice and theory are two different things. So the big news here is that, you probably didn't know this, but Ireland is a world leader in the use of PPP. Now, where's PPP big? PPP is huge in the United Kingdom. It was launched in 1992 it's called the Private Finance Initiative. Tony Blair didn't like the sound of that, and they rebranded it PPP because partnership sounds nice, and that was in 1997. So they're the world leader without a question. There's no doubt there that over 500 billion has been invested in infrastructure through PFI or PPP in the UK. We're not at that level, but in terms of, we'll say, the extent of PPP investment as a proportion of, we'll say, overall capital investment, Ireland is up there with the big guys at about around 7 or 8% of overall public investment in the last number of years has been accounted for by PPP. So where are these PPPs being used, and what are the projects and what are the values? So very quickly, I just want to run through them. 9 motorways. There's another 1 under construction and another 2 on the way, with a contractual capital value, just a capital value of over 4 billion. I estimate 23 schools, but they're in bundles of contract. The contracts are for bundle of schools. Capital value 404 million. That includes schools like the National Maritime College in Cork and the Cork Music School, but the rest are primary and secondary schools. The National Convention Centre, down on the Quays. Very, very interesting project. If you read the CNAG report, the contracted capital value is 170 million. I'll give you the full cost in a moment. The Court Services Building in Dublin, that's 130 million. And kind of under the radar are these water and wastewater treatment plants. I reckon there's about 76. It's hard to get information, really hard to get information from the Department of Environment. Closed door policy there. But over, I'm not sure how much, but certainly over 373 million on water infrastructure. And all those contracts have been taken over, by the way, by Irish Water, taken from the local authorities. On top of that, we've had 1 social housing project that was delivered. The rest collapsed, unfortunately, because of the crash. And that's one of the risks that ordinary people take. It's not just risks that are taken by the private sector, but ordinary people take risks as well when we go down the PPP route, and if the project isn't delivered because there's a global financial crisis, people are left without houses, and unfortunately that's happened. And there's a long-going saga in relation to Poolbeg, and I could keep going all day if we talked about that, but it's got the green light. I estimate I've pieced together the figures, but the Department of Finance has actually finally started to release pretty accurate data on the value of PPP investment in Ireland now, and it's about 5.7 billion in terms of contracted capital value, but the actual overall cost looking down the line is going to be much bigger. So just to give you an indication, you see there that earlier I said that the capital value of the convention centre was 170 million, but the contract is going to cost the taxpayer 750 million because it's a 25 or 30 year contract. So we're going to pay the private contractor to operate that over 20 or 30 years. Why? Why is the government going down the route of PPP? What's the attraction? I've mentioned some already. The official rationale, is that PPP can deliver better value for money. We can get this infrastructure delivered and operated at a cost that's cheaper than we would get by using traditional procurement methods. The jury's well out on that, but that's the official rationale. Why would that argument be put in place? Well, what's driving value for money under PPP as opposed to traditional procurement? One, we're told, is competition for contracts. Now, you're not guaranteed that there will be competition for contracts. There were only two bidders for the convention centre, for instance, just to highlight that it doesn't always happen. And secondly, risk transfer, as I mentioned earlier. They're seen as key drivers of value for money under PPP that cannot be accrued under traditional procurement methods, but it's open to question. There are, of course, obstacles to getting value for money under PPP. That's because, number one, as I said, the private sector borrows the money. The private sector cannot borrow at rates as low as the government. All right? So that's an obstacle, and they must get over that hurdle if they're to deliver value for money overall. And secondly, there are costs that and significant costs that tend to get ignored. We call them transaction costs in relation to setting up the whole PPP process. Putting projects out for tender, the consultants, etc., and the lawyers who knock their heads together to draw up the contracts, and also the costs in relation to managing the contracts over time. They are significant, and in the literature we're told they can amount to about 5 to 10% of capital value. But they tend to be ignored in the value for money assessments that are used to support the case for PPP. And then we can't get through today without talking about off-balance sheet financing. I find it funny, when you got taxi drivers became really au fait with the workings of bond markets in recent years, and now everybody's talking about off-balance sheet financing. It's tricky, and I'm going to get back to it, because the reality is, for PPP, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. We do pay for it, but from a government perspective, the rules of accounting allow this money to be off-balance sheet. Means it doesn't count against general government debt or the general government deficit. So basically, the attraction for government is, yes, it shows up in the books, okay, but on a phased basis over time. Under traditional procurement, the books take the hit the day the contractors are paid, but now they're paid over time. And that's the attraction for government. It doesn't have such a big hit on the books. There are off-balance sheet financing, we understand, is very relevant to Irish Water as well. There are slight differences, but I do want to get back to that. So what do we know about the evidence? And the answer is, in relation to Ireland, not a lot, okay? And one of the problems with that, and I mentioned that to some people at coffee, it's very hard to get information. First and foremost, I've listed all the infrastructure. Yes, PPP has delivered important infrastructure, schools, roads, etc., etc. But contrary to the promise that it would happen very quickly, that hasn't happened. We've done a study, my colleagues and I at the university, on tendering periods for PPP contracts, and they're very, very long. They run on average 35 months is the average tendering period we established for PPP contracts in Ireland, and that's actually quite long, and it's long comparatively. It's 19 months in Canada, but they're the world leader. The UK is 34 months as well, which means these things are complicated, and it takes a while to get through the procurement process and to deliver the projects quickly, which was one of the promises. Second point I have there is that we don't actually have official data on value for money. There's small amounts that I pieced together coming in the next slide. We've nothing on roads. Roads is where all the money was spent on PPP. 4.3 billion contracted capital value. Not one value for money study conducted that's out there in the public domain to tell us whether they delivered value for money or not. Not one. It's worth saying as well that yes, PPP has delivered a lot of projects, but it's also failed on a number of other projects. So some of the ones that I've mentioned there, social housing, mentioned already. Hospital co-location was not defined PPP, but it actually had all the attributes of PPP, all the characteristics. And there's other ones there: nursing homes, National Oncology Network. It appears it has been quite difficult to bring PPPs to fruition in the health sector. The incinerator has been held up for years, and after the crash, proposed PPPs like Metro North were cancelled as well. So it hasn't been plain sailing by any stretch of the imagination. What about value for money? This is the only data that is out there on value for money on PPPs. I've got three individual projects and all water services at the bottom. And what I've done there is I've just given you the value for money assessment figure. So before the PPP gets the green light, part of the process is that the government must do a value for money assessment, which means it compares what it thinks it will cost under PPP with the hypothetical cost of doing it under traditional procurement. So there's a lot of guesswork in here, and it's wide open to manipulation. Wide open. Now, the CNAG has done some audits of PPPs. As I said, it hasn't done roads, and we rely almost entirely on the CNAG for accurate information. So on the courts PPP, the courts buildings, the estimate from that value for money assessment was that the PPP would deliver 22 million in savings vis-a-vis traditional procurement, and that amounted to 6% of the contracted capital value. Not a trivial amount, 22 million, but at the same time, not very high. And when you take into account omissions like the transaction costs that I mentioned earlier, there are reasons to be sceptical, and that's what I get into on the next slide. The proposed value for money on the conference centre there is none really. Okay, there isn't any. It's 0.01. 6 million on a 750 million project is nothing. So, I mean, well within the margin of error, as you can see. And there were real questions about the procurement process in that case, because as I said, there were only two bidders, and they produced two completely divergent bids, which makes you question what exactly, how they were guided on the procurement process. Real questions about the governance of that one, in my view. The schools pilot project is the only project where you have a very, very detailed assessment of how it's procured by the CNAG. Originally, the Department of Education, they're not responsible for doing this anymore. It's now the National Development Finance Agency. But originally the Department of Education put forward an estimate we'll get 6% value for money, okay? You know, i.e. about 7.2 million by going down the route of PPP rather than procuring by traditional means. We'll see on the next slide what the reality turned out to be. And then the Department of Environment, I've been battling with these guys for years to get data off them. They're appalling to deal with. But their official data, as revealed in an answer by Phil Hogan to a PQ, was that the value for money on, I think that they provided data on about 15 projects, ranged between 2 and 48%. I mean, it's nonsense, right? I mean, 48%, there's no way there was 48% value for money achieved. But you know, this is what was provided by Phil Hogan in the Dáil last year. So where's the scepticism? On the schools, the value for money assessment said 6%. The CNAG went in, redid the calculations and said, lads, you got it all wrong, okay? And you're going to lose money. Between 12 and 18% will be the losses. Now, that was early doors. That was early. And that was one of the first projects. So, I mean, there's reasons to believe, it was reasonable to believe that the procurement practice, etc., has sharpened up in the meantime. But that was what the CNAG found back in 2003. I myself have managed by devious means to get my hands on some of the value for money assessments that were used to support the case for PPP in the water services sector. And if my undergrad students produced the reports that supported those, I'd fail them. Some really, really dreadful estimates of value for money and really, really fundamental errors. These reports were done by firms of consulting engineers who had a vested interest in actually promoting the PPP. So I'm talking about the small ones under 20 million. If it's over 20 million, they're now, the VFM assessments are done by the National Development Finance Agency, and that's a different ballgame because they should know what they're doing. I mentioned transaction costs, so I won't get into that again. Value for money is not just about the estimates that are derived before the contract is awarded. Value for money will only be realised over time, and it'll only be realised if contracts are actually properly managed and these private sector operators are kept on their toes. If they fail to perform and the contract says that risk was transferred and you're not supposed to get paid if you underperform, that should actually happen. On the first schools project, I visited the schools. There were plenty of problems and plenty of reasons for withholding payments from the private sector. Not one penalty and not one withholding of payment happened on those. Now, that is alluded to by the CNAG in its annual review of PPPs, and the NDFA have now taken over the management of these schools because they've recognised the same thing, that contract management wasn't actually happening on the ground. And if it's not happening, the arguments about risk transfer and value for money, they go out the window. So that's why there are reasons for scepticism. I'll skip that point. So everything that I said here really raises an issue about the legitimacy of PPP as a form of governance. I mean, basic democratic principles mean that we as citizens should have public confidence in our policymakers when they take a decision to, we'll say, outsource the provision of infrastructure and public services. We can't really have that unless there's accountability. But there's a big, big accountability gap in relation to PPP. On the plus side, yes, there is an argument for PPP because, first and foremost, the procurement process allows for looking at the project over the whole project life cycle. So you're looking at a 30-year project, not just building it, and factoring in issues around management and the operation of assets. And that's a good thing, okay? It sharpens the mind of the people who make decisions as part of the appraisal process. And you have the contract document, okay, which is only as good as what's in it, naturally, okay? But you do have a contract that you can hold over private contractors. But the reality, of course, is that worldwide, more than 50% of PPP contracts are renegotiated. So you're not, that's just a fact because circumstances change. And there's a case for that, but it means that the private sector can, of course, wriggle out of its responsibilities if necessary. That's on the plus side. But going back to this accountability gap, we can't really have faith unless we have information. But PPPs are notorious for being opaque, and it's really, really difficult to get your hands on information around PPPs, around value for money appraisals, etc., because what's put up is the sign saying commercially sensitive information, you're not getting your hands on it. And it's a cloak that has been used and used all too often in this country and in other countries to stop people from asking or getting information, reasonable questions around, how was the value for money appraisal done? Can we actually look at the figures and can we assess them and interrogate them independently? You can't do that in this country. You've got to rely on the Controller and Auditor General, but the CNAG has only finite resources, and it hasn't done anything like, we'll say, the job that the National Audit Office would have done in the UK, where there's a whole raft of reports on PPP. And even more recently, they've upped their game in terms of putting information out in the public. For instance, in Australia, you can, in the state of Victoria, which is a world leader on PPP, you can access contract documents. They might be redacted to a degree, but the value for money assessments, they're put out there, and you can actually interrogate those. That information just isn't in the public domain in Ireland. The Public Accounts Committee has lamented this as well. They've called people in, contractors and public sector decision makers on PPP, but they were blanked. So it's on the minutes of it's in the minutes of the Dáil. The PAC has lamented the fact that it can't get the information that it requires because commercial sensitivity is used as an excuse to conceal information around PPP. So, just to conclude, I'll just go through some of the points that I've made. I'll get back to off-balance sheet financing. It wouldn't be the same. There would be no point being here unless we touch on that again. First and foremost, PPP. Ireland is still go down the road of PPP. There's no question. Unfortunately, it's not evidence-based. And there's a real case for, a real strong case for some kind of public or independent review of PPPs. In 2001, in the UK, a commission on PPPs was established, and they produced a really good review of the 10-year experience they've had in the UK. We need something like that in Ireland, particularly as the government is pinning its hopes on PPP as a means of stimulus going forward. So that's one thing. I like that quote. This is the kind of nonsense that we hear all the time around PPP. This is a quote from a NIBEC report, 2009, but I thought it was worth putting in there. It's a proven and tested mechanism, and it's so successful. And the measure of success is people come from other countries and they visit to see what we're doing. Seriously. Okay. I think I've made the case already. I mean, I'm not out there. I'm not a maverick when I make a case for a big drive on public investment. The time is now, and the case is compelling. On this question of off-balance sheet financing, there's no question that it is a criterion for what's going on Irish water, and it is a criterion that's also used for the new PPP programme, the new PPP programme that has been announced in 2012, the new stimulus programme. On PPP, when I see off-balance sheet financing, I get a bit edgy. I get a bit nervous. I think Enron, okay? Enron, special purpose vehicles, off-balance sheet financing. And I believe I'm right to be nervous. The government, there's a real politic here, okay? So the accounting rules around the publication, around the estimate of general government deficit, general government debt, and so on, they are what they are. And we've signed up to the fiscal compact, etc., etc. So the government is constrained on that. So there is a case, for instance, for the Irish water setup, don't shoot me, okay, on off-balance sheet financing means. There's some case there. But it really is a bit of a red herring. The point was made from the floor earlier. They're still public debts. There's no way around that. They remain public debts. And for the first time in the last budget, the documents actually had an annex where they provided, for the first time, because they were requested to do so, I think by the IMF or the Troika, they provided information on contingent liabilities, which include the liabilities that might be realised as a result of how things work out on PPP. My problem with off-balance sheet financing in relation to PPP is that it can be used to distort decisions. The basic decision that in relation to whether a capital project should be given the green light or not, does it yield positive net social returns? Do the benefits exceed the cost? That's the basic cost-benefit criterion that we should apply. There's a really strong track record of that not happening, particularly in the UK, where projects have not been given the green light, okay, because, well, there's a few things there, okay. The only reason they've gone down that route in the UK is to exploit off-balance sheet financing. And in some cases, if it turned out that a project could not be considered off-balance sheet financing, given the way the risks have been distributed and so on, the project doesn't get the go-ahead. So it can distort decisions on whether to go ahead or not to go ahead on projects. That is a problem. We might get back to that again. I'm sure we will, actually, when we get down to the question. So a lot of that is exemplified in the case of Irish water. Just to conclude, my interest around PPP is around the broader question of procurement, and I truly believe that big public policy goal is efficient investment. That means getting the decisions right in relation to project selection, project appraisal, running the procurement and the management of infrastructure once it's built. This raises loads of infrastructure policy issues. I like the dichotomy between finance and funding issues. There's plenty of finance out there. Okay? The government can either borrow it or the private sector companies who run PPPs can borrow it. There's no shortage of finance. There's a big push to get pension funds involved in financing infrastructure, but it's not happening for various reasons. One is they don't like taking on construction risk. That's one of the reasons. Even though there are even though the profile of long-term steady returns that you can get from infrastructure should attract the pension industry, it hasn't happened really worldwide to date. That's finance. Funding is different. Funding is how it's paid back over time. And what governments have to decide then is the mix between whether it's coming from the exchequer or the end user is going to play. Now, you can see where I'm coming from in relation to Irish Water. When governments get decisions around that wrong, okay, you're getting into the equity issues and the politics around infrastructure. And politicians, I think, clearly, okay, Irish Water is the perfect example, and it demonstrates that when they make mistakes or they underestimate the politics around infrastructure, the outcomes can be fairly calamitous, as we now understand. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.